Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I think this is number 17, perhaps number 18 in the podcast series since we began doing this earlier this year. And I'm really pleased here today to have somebody with me who I just said to him mere moments ago. I said, Bob, I mean, you don't know it, but I've known your work for literally the better part of 3 decades, and you don't know me from proverbial Adam, except in the last couple of months because well, I'm Greg Javer, the host of the Ed Wood Summit podcast, writer at Ed Wood Wednesdays, Joe Blevins's indispensable Ed Wood Wednesdays at his Dead to Rights blog, D2R. Uh, I always get this wrong. Joe Blevins is going to hate me. He always d2rights.blogspot.com, I believe is the URL. I'll link to it and make life simpler for you because you can just click away on the link and not have to actually type that in. So a little bit of an experiment here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast this week. We're shooting on Skype for the first time. And so if this viewpoint or this view that you see right now, I'm not sure how this is actually going to record, Bob. I don't think either one of us know. So it's gonna be interesting to see how it looks. But in any case, we're on a together mode view here on Skype where the two of us appear to be perhaps sitting over the edge of a stone stairwell in a very natural setting. I joked with Bob as we were getting a view on this and trying to set it up. I'm like, it almost looks like maybe we're in Griffith Park, or maybe we're in Corriganville. We'll
Uh-huh.
talk more. We'll talk more about Corriganville as we get a little bit deeper into this conversation. Because what we're going to talk about here today is Bob's going to tell us some stories that you've never heard before about Valda Hansen. Of course, the white ghost from Night of the Ghouls, a close associate of Ed Wood's. And Bob himself, again, I mentioned reading his stuff going way, way back in the day. So early 90s, uh, magazines like European Trash Cinema, cult film magazines like European Trash Cinema, certainly the indispensable Video Watchdog. Got to give Tim Lucas a shout out for that one. Craig Ledbetter a shout out for European Trash Cinema, among other zines that Bob wrote for. But I remember I was crazy. I just told him a little bit ago. I was crazy, just like he was, for Jess Franco movies and collect them. Collect. You did it too, I bet, where you have
Hmm.
three and four VHS
Yep.
versions of one
Yep.
individual Franco movie
Right. Yes.
times like
Right.
220 movies, so you
Right.
have chests and chests full of
Mhm.
multiple variants of different Jesus Franco
Yes.
movies. And
Yes.
then decades later, they all come out in these pristine Blu-rays, and it's which I never would have even fathomed. That never would have happened, by the way, if it wasn't for guys like Bob, who were real champions for independent or cultish filmmakers. So I want to turn this right over to Bob so he can tell us a little bit more about himself. But also, I would like to know, Bob, uh, Ed Wood. How did you get into Ed Wood initially?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate your invitation here. And just one thing, I did not write for Video Watchdog, Tim Lucas's wonderful magazine. I did not get around to writing for them. I had thought about it, but I was writing at the time. At that time, Video Watchdog, I think, just had started up, so I never did get an article in there. But I started to write for like a magazine called Blood Times, published by Lewis Paul. I think he lived in Long Island City back then, early '90s. He was and he published this magazine, and he published it was about European cinema, exploitation, horror, B cinema, Asian cinema. It was all in this one magazine. Walt, you know, the Krimis from Germany, the Giallos from Italy, and I was writing for them in European trash cinema, and that's how it all started.
Cool. Forgive me. I have a distinct memory of you writing for Video Watchdog, so that shows you,
No,
nearly 30 years on,
right? No,
how much my memory has failed.
I,
This will
I,
cast
I
doubt
did
upon everything that I say.
That's a fine magazine, and I did not write for them, but
Yeah.
I did write for European Trash Cinema from 1993 or four till it was gone in 1999. Once again, I think the internet kind of killed it. Okay,
Yeah.
uh, when the internet came out, a lot of those fanzines disappeared all of a sudden,
Right.
and so the Blood Times and European Trash Cinema magazine disappeared. Video Watchdog was around for a number of years. Now they're gone, sadly, and a lot of some are a few. There's a few magazines still out there, but now it's all the internet. Now it's like you know I mean, I have like a Just Franco blog now. I have like a page that's just deals with the European exploitation cinema on Facebook.
Yeah.
I publish images of these kind of movies on Instagram, and I'm working on a book right now about cult movies, and it's all gone away. That era of fansies. Now, cult movies, I understand, is still around, right? Cult movies.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
don't.
that's
I'm unfortunately way out of touch with the pop culture.
right. And there was, I think it was Cult Movies magazine back then that was at a local store, and I was just working as a freelance writer at that time. I had been working as a freelance writer in the late 70s, early 80s, and actually made a living at it back then. It's hard to do that now, make a living as a
Yeah.
freelance writer. I was paying the rent. Had a car. All my expenses were covered by my freelance writing career, and you can't. It's really hard to do it nowadays because nobody wants to pay writers anymore, basically, because they can get it for get it
Sure.
for free on the internet, or unless you're working for like the New York
Sure.
Times, something like that.
I've
And
I was gonna say I've written about 250 Ed Wood articles here in the last 5 or 6 years, and I've not made a single dime off of
right,
it.
right.
Right. Right.
Well, I did. In fact, the last, so I was working as a pretty well-paid freelancer for about 10 years, and but I was writing about drive-in movies then when they were around, and I was writing about
Yeah.
movies like Phantasm when that came out in the late 70s. I remember I wrote a very well-received article on that, and I was getting published in local and regional journals. And what happened was in the early 90s, by that time I had a VCR, and so I started looking at movies back then. But really, and this is going to be a long story. It goes all the way back to the early 60s. Let's go back to the 60s. Now
Okay.
I'm about 10 years old, and one night, Saturday night, I'm sitting up with my parents, or watching Jackie Gleason or something like that, and let's say 1961 or 1962, and I see that on 11:30 tonight on the Monster Movie Show, there's going to be a movie called Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Wow.
It's going to be on this show. And
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, I want to see that, Mom and Dad." "No, you got to go to bed. You got to get up early for church tomorrow." So they wouldn't let me see it. But I remember the graphic was like flying saucers flying through space towards like an image of Earth, a crude drawing, and then a picture of Bela Lugosi looming over the whole scene. And I thought about that for years. And then it never really showed locally again. Then in the mid 60s, it started showing locally all the time on TV, and I could watch it then. And I watched it a few times, and I thought, my God, this is really low budget. At that time, I was into Hammer films, and I was big Hollywood films. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize this was so cheap, but it's a lot of fun." And then I forgot about it. And then finally, when I got going way ahead, way ahead, way ahead, I was into European art films for a while. When I got my VCR, then I got my own. I got my own video VHS of Plan 9 from Outer Space, and I saw that, and I saw Bride of the Monster, and I saw Night of the Ghouls, and I thought maybe I should do some writing about this film about Ed Wood, because I was fascinated with Ed Wood, and try to sell it. And so a local newspaper, which was publishing me, said, "Yeah, write an article about Ed Wood." So I did write an article about Ed Wood. They published it. I got paid for it. This was like in maybe 1991. Okay, this was before the movie. I think it was right before Rudy Gray's book came out. I don't
Yeah.
know. When did the Medved book come out? That really kind of put Ed Wood on the map too. Remember?
Well, there was the oh God, I should know this off the top of my head, Bob. I think there was the 50 worst films of all time, something
Right,
like that.
right,
And then the
right.
second book was the Golden Turkey Awards. So I think Ed's mentioned, or I don't think, actually I can't even remember. Is that even? I've written
No,
articles about this and I can't remember. But
he's mentioned.
nonetheless, we're talking about 78 or
Right,
9 or
right.
so, right?
And that really put Ed Wood on the map, though, to a certain degree,
Yeah,
because the Medveds were so dismissive of his films. It got people interested in seeing them. Okay, I mean, I was already interested from seeing them on late night shows in the '60s or wanting to, and
right.
then when the Medved book came out, the way I remember they were describing Bride of the Monster, which I hadn't seen at that point in the late '70s, and they were saying, and it all ends with Bela Lugosi fighting a rubber octopus and nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh my God, I got to see this."
Yeah, that sounds really good,
And,
right?
but
It's unfortunately,
they were putting
unfortunately.
it down. They were putting it down.
Oh yeah, that's actually something that the derisive viewpoint, the whole
Right.
world's worst filmmaker thing. That was when Ed sort of, actually, even prior to that, he had already sort of that moniker stuck, and it had started to float around a little bit, but it didn't really come
Right.
together until the medveds brought it together, and then subsequently, of course, there was active research groups that really started working around Ed's previous work and started to discover that he'd done all these other things. He wrote pornography and he made films and he did all these other crazy things, and that subsequently morphed into and evolved into Nightmare of Ecstasy, which I think is sort of the lightning in a bottle moment. Nightmare of Ecstasy ends up becoming the Disney touchstone Tim Burton Johnny Depp biopic of Ed, and
Right.
now we've gone from something that guys like me and you all of our lives have heard about and would have known about. Now it goes from there to here, stuff that everyone will have at least a little bit have heard about. Although
Right.
I ask people all the time, Bob, I'm like, remember that movie Ed Wood with Johnny Depp? People who are old enough to have remembered, and they go, no, I don't know what you're talking about, Greg. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. And I remember that Jess Franco. Besides, I actually interviewed. I had an interview with him. I
Wow.
interviewed him in 2005 when he was still alive, and actually, a few years ago, it was a never published interview. And this magazine, Arts Decades, actually published this vintage interview with him.
Wow.
And of course, it's just been a few books written by Stephen Thrower about him. But I published this interview. I was happy about that. I got a chance to talk to him, and question, but there was another interview somebody did with Jess Franco. He was considered to be one of the world's worst filmmakers because he made all these kind of schlocky, cheap horror films. And they were saying, Jess, what do you think of Ed Wood in America? And Jess Franco said, well, he's a worse filmmaker than I am, isn't he? that, that,
You know,
that, that he said, yeah, Ed Wood, he's a worse filmmaker than I am. He was joking about it, that everybody considered him the worst filmmaker, but he said, no, Ed Wood, he's the worst filmmaker than I am. So that was the joke back then, that
interesting.
the serious film critics or serious people didn't watch their films and they didn't take them seriously, but now they do.
They do. I think actually it's taken a little while for a serious viewpoint on Ed to catch up. But
Right.
in the case of Franco, this isn't the Jess Franco podcast, but you have an open invite to come back and talk about Jess Franco. That's
Oh
amazing.
yes.
Did you meet? I assume Lena Romay was with him when you
Yeah.
interviewed him.
Well,
That's amazing, right?
I no, I interviewed him actually. It was over a long distance telephone line, believe it or
Oh,
not,
okay.
and I did several long distance calls, and I talked with Lena by internet, by email, because she kind of set
Wow.
it up. Jess was really sick at that time.
Okay.
He died a long, lingering.
Right. Right.
He was in a wheelchair for the last 10 years of his life. But yeah, she was a very nice lady. Then she passed away, and then I did get to interview him, but he joked about that. He had heard of Ed Wood, and I
Right.
don't even think he had ever seen one of his films actually. But
Right.
I still, I mean, I still got them both. I mean, I wish as many Ed Wood films would come out in Blu-ray as Jess Franco films have.
I know. I know. Well, hopefully, we'll see, right? We've got a couple, but
Right.
there's a really, really long way to go, actually. But
So
you mentioned, well, real quick, I wanted to say you mentioned Stephen Thrower. I want to give a shout out. We shouted out Tim Lucas, Craig Ledbetter. Let's shout out Stephen Thrower, Eyeball,
right,
one of the very best of its kind in the
never
day.
seen
The
right.
most well written, serious film analysis, right? Because we're talking about things that a lot of people think nobody really takes that
Right,
seriously, but
right,
some of us do. Yeah.
right, and that's the kind of writing I wanted to do. And the only place I could do it was these zines, which I found, and then even a local newspaper let me finally do an article on Ed Wood. This was in the early night. This was right before I met Valda. I'm sorry, Valda, and so I wrote that, and then I said, "Jesus, I got to start." I was out of work at the time because I had another job, and I had a job in an X-rated movie theater, believe it or not, as a night manager. Okay,
Oh, cool.
but that theater closed down in the early '90s because they were closing down. You know what I mean? And they were showing
Yeah.
Vanessa Del Rio films and things like
On
that.
like 35 millimeter?
Yeah,
Still
30.
wow, that's real cool. Yeah.
They were showing 35 millimeter. I worked there in the 1980s, and then, we got held up a few times at night because and
Yeah.
it was in the inner city. It was a trip though. They showed a lot of interesting stuff. They showed Gerard Damiano films, things like that. Some of the better
Yeah.
made, some of the better made X films. So then I was out of work, and I said, I got to start making a living again as a freelance writer. I said, why don't I write this big article about Ed Wood and try to sell it to a major magazine? So I started making phone calls. And I talked to somebody, I think it was at Cult Movies. Somebody referred me to him. I can't remember the guy's name, but he said, you got to talk. He said, yeah. He said, Ed's dead. He said, Kathy Wood is still around, but I don't know how to contact her. But he said, you should talk to Valda Hansen because she was one of Ed Wood's best and closest friends.
Okay.
And then he said, give me a call back. He said, write me a letter. This was back when people wrote letters. He said, write me a letter. I said, can we do this by phone? Because I want to get this article done. He goes, okay, call me back in a few weeks. He goes, I'll try to get her contact information. So I called him back, and he wasn't there. Something happened. And I talked to another guy there, and he said, oh, I know Bella. He goes, I'll give you her number. He goes, she'd like to talk to you because she's really been ill lately, and she's kind of convalescing, and she's definitely wants to talk to people about Ed Wood, and I'm sure she'd call. And he gave me her number, her telephone number, and I dialed her up, introduced myself, and she said, oh, I'd love to talk about Ed Wood. And I said, well, I know you're busy. She goes, no, I've got a lot. And she said she had a lot of time, and she had a lot of time then on a day-by-day basis. Unfortunately, she only had about a year and a half left to live, and this was probably in late 1991, early 1992.
Right.
And probably early 1992, more of, and we talked for about a year, up to about a few months before her death, and then she couldn't even talk anymore towards the end. But she almost immediately told me that she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was hoping to survive it, obviously, and she was going through like an operation, which she hoped would get rid of it, or at least where it was the worst, and that she didn't like going into the hospital, and she didn't plan to have, she couldn't afford and she didn't want to have any kind of chemo or radiation therapy, which they had at that time. She said she believed in holistic, natural medicines, and she was on a natural kind of vegan diet type thing.
Oh, wow.
She was taking supplements, I remember she told me, and she was doing all kinds of things she wanted to do. Unfortunately, she lost the battle. Okay, and but very, very. So it has a very sad ending, her story. And what happened was, I said, okay, let me call you back. I called her back. Like, she goes, call me back tomorrow. And I called her back, and she had a doctor's appointment. And I called her back, and she said, yeah. She goes, I'm going to the hospital next week. So she did have an operation. When she got out of the hospital, she said, yeah. She said it was successful, but she goes, she had a melanoma, I guess, type condition as a result of it. She had a type of skin cancer. Okay, I can't remember exactly. I think she had it on her leg, another part of her body, and it developed. And she had parts of the tissue removed, and she still had to have treatment for the melanoma. And they said, okay, we want you. I think they wanted her to take some kind of chemotherapy. Now, this was 30 years ago. Okay, so they weren't as sophisticated as they are now on cancer therapy. So they wanted her to have some kind of chemotherapy, radiation, and she checked, and she said she couldn't afford it. Number one, it would have cost like obviously tens of thousands of dollars, and she had been an unemployed actress for years. We'll talk more about what was happening with her acting career because there's a lot of misinformation about that. But in any case, and I think she was with Lee Harris at that time, but yeah. In any case, or maybe someone else, but she said that she had a friend who was a caregiver, and I said, well, I wish I could help you, Velda. She goes, well, you're helping me by talking to me, Bob. She goes, I want to help you with your article, and because and so we talked, and we talked for about a year and a half leading up to her death, and sometimes on a daily basis, she was sending me things, I was sending her questions, back and forth. We got into some really heavy conversations about all kinds of things, but mostly about Ed Wood, the old Hollywood of Ed Wood of the 50s and 60s, which is still kind of obscure, and her own life and her own philosophy and her own interactions with Ed. And she was very upbeat through the whole time, and she was in quite a bit of pain because she couldn't afford treatment, she couldn't afford pain medication. Okay, so I advised her. I said, can you get on Medicaid? Because they had Medicaid back then. Okay. And I had been on Medicaid a few years before that because of a major illness I had, and I couldn't work. And I got on it. I said, you should certainly be able to get on it. And for some reason, she said she wasn't able to get on it. out in California. I don't know why, but she said she couldn't get on it. Maybe she didn't ask, but I got the impression that she didn't really want to be on it, but she said she couldn't get on it. So she had no income to help battle her disease. She was just doing it with like supplements and her diet. And she was just, she was pretty much immobile because she was in so much pain most of the time. But she could talk, and we talked and laughed, and I wish I could have helped her more. I wish I could have done something to help her financially. I was out of work myself, and she was a person in need, I think, of mostly of someone to talk with her. And she really loved talking about those days, about Ed Wood. She really loved Ed Wood. It was an incredible platonic friendship there. And she really understood what he was all about. And it's not the Ed Wood either that you usually think of. He had a very serious side. He had a very interesting sense of humor, according to Valda. I have a very interesting sense of humor. She used to say, she said, Bob, you remind me of Ed Wood's sense of humor, because we both found the same things funny. But he was very serious also, and he took his filmmaking very seriously too. She made that point that in fact, she was talking about Night of the Ghouls. She said that before he was, another actress was scheduled to play that role. Okay, you probably know about that, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, she said another actress. I think it's in the book. It's somewhere. But somebody else involved with the production, one of the investors, and Ed was independent, so he got money from where he could get it. And one of the investors said, "Okay, yeah, I'll give you money, but this actress has to play this," because he had the script, the White Ghost role, and Ed didn't want the other actress. He wanted Valda to play it because he had seen her in a play, and I think it was. I got the book right. I think it was called "Accidentally Yours." The play.
Accidentally Yours,
right.
Supposedly, right? There's conflicting stories about that, which is the conflicting story that I've heard is that she was his neighbor. She was his neighbor when he got the gig. So this is totally a bullshit story, but it sounds really fun. Some gentleman named Ed Silly was a Fuller Brush salesperson, and he showed up at Ed's house, and Ed offered him a drink, and they started to drink, and they got a little bit hammered, and Ed talked Ed Silly into funding Night of the Ghouls, and his neighbor at the time happened to be Valda Hansen, so he was, of course, like, I'm going to cast her. And that's a nonsense story, but that story is floating around out there. Yeah, I've heard the same thing. He saw her in a play of Accidentally Yours, and he went backstage afterwards to introduce himself. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine exactly how they met. You hear different versions of different events, but what I do know is that Ed obviously had a close relationship with her, as you said. You said platonic, which is interesting because he clearly adored her. If you saw the home movie footage in the Plan 9 Companion, which she maintained that for 30 years or so because it was shot in the early 60s. Her mom and herself are hanging out with Ed and the dog. And Ed obviously has trained the dog really, really well. And Ed looks good. He looks reasonably healthy and he looks good. But he also looks like, to me, he's trying to portray himself as quite masculine. He's wearing a tight black shirt, open at the neck, and he's trying to look really good for her. And it's just my opinion, my viewpoint on that footage, which again is in the Plan 9 Companion. And you mentioned Lee Harris. So you said Lee Harris was with her at the time from, I think it's in Cult Movies. Cult Movies wrote like crazy about Ed Wood in the day. So when I say Nightmare of Ecstasy is kind of responsible for the lightning in a bottle moment, you've got to give credit to people like people at Cult Movies, like, and Michael Kopner, I think, was the editor. And there were other people who wrote a lot about Ed Wood, and there were people like Mark Carducci. I think Al Doshna worked on the Plan 9 Companion, and Lee Harris certainly. And Lee Harris is still very active in the Facebook group where you and I met just a few months ago, all these years later.
Right. And yeah, I think at that time that she told me she was close friends with Lee Harris. Okay, she said she knew him. She said she was she said that he was a friend of hers, and that I think Kopner, the editor, was she knew him. He was a friend of hers, and that's how I found out about her death, because I had lost touch with her for a few months before her death. I was trying to reach her, and she wasn't answering my letters. When I call on the phone, it would just get an answer machine, so I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then I read about it in Cult Movies that she had passed away, and I think I read that a month after she had gone, maybe in August of '93.
Right.
I felt so bad about that. But yeah, she mentioned Michael Copner and Lee Harris a lot, and she appreciated them as people, and she liked that magazine Cult Movies a lot. She thought it was one of the ones that treated Ed with the respect that he deserved. Okay, and
It's practically like the Ed Wood magazine when you look
right.
back, especially at issues right from that uh, nexus from 70 or from 92 through about 94, 95. Every
Right.
issue, some issues are almost entirely in some way, shape, or form revolving around Ed.
Yes, exactly. So, she spoke how much she appreciated that magazine and the people who, put it together and how much they appreciated Ed. And so, we just talked, and she would just tell me an awful lot of things which were going down around that time. And the book came out. I don't remember the exact time in '92. It's published in '92. I think I got a hold of it just around the time she had passed away, so we didn't get a chance to talk about the book that much. But she was talking about how much she enjoyed participating in it. Okay, and then she was one of the last letters she wrote to me, and I talked to her on the phone. She goes, I'm going to write you, give you some information. And then she sent me a letter, and then I never heard from her after that. One of the last letters she wrote to me, she wrote like a full filmography of herself, okay?
Yeah.
And there's titles on that filmography which you will not find. They're not in the book. They're not in any other book that I've seen. They're not in IMDb, certainly, that she had been in, okay? And she did not, according to the Wikipedia and IMDb, she did not retire from acting in the mid 70s. I mean, she told me she was still looking for acting roles, and that she was definitely still interested in continuing her acting career if she could, if
Yeah.
her health improved, and that she didn't have any plans on retiring, and that and that she had been looking for work all along, and that she was
Yeah.
definitely not retired. She had told me she had just been like she had told me she was in Ray Dennis Steckler's Cynthia the Devil Doll in 1970 or 71. That's not in any filmography I've seen of hers.
Right. And you mentioned this on the private Ed Wood Facebook group that we're a part of a few weeks back, and a few other people took a look at some of these films, and you yourself, me also, not only Cynthia the Devil's Doll, but also Gun Crazy, starring Drew Barrymore, right?
Right.
Sh- and we're like, we don't see Valda anywhere there, but
Right.
she remembers it, and so were they scenes that hit the cutting room floor, presumably?
I would think that's probably what happened, okay? Because these are not big roles. She just appeared in them, and
Hmm.
well, I mean, obviously her biggest role, from what I've seen, it was in Night of the Ghouls, okay? Because she
Right.
plays the ghost in several scenes. Then you see her like kind of indoors at the end, or it's
Yeah.
like she's outside. That's probably her most substantial role, and unless there's some I don't know. There's one I still haven't seen, the biker movie she was in, Outlaw Riders. Maybe she's got a big role in that film.
Oh, you didn't watch that yet?
No, I haven't had a chance to see it yet.
Yeah, I know. I know. It's well. I think we were talking about it. And we found the YouTube link a week or two ago. You got to watch. It's cool. I love biker movies from the early
Oh,
'70s. But you're right, Bob. I mean, she had such minuscule parts, and
right.
the smattering of movies she made over a relatively lengthy period of time. We're talking about a 30 plus year stretch where it's not a very big filmography. But
No.
Night of the Ghouls, yeah. So certainly her first time out, an indelible performance that's very memorable, and in a film that's was unseen for decades, so
Right. Right.
it's not like anybody really ever would have known. But I want to just really quickly bounce back a little bit to for those of you who maybe don't know a whole lot about Valda Hansen. uh, I'm sure many of you do, but so Valda, uh, the story partly is the accidentally yours, Ed visiting her backstage. She's an ingenue. She's 16 years old at the time he's about to make Night of the Ghouls. Well, actually, first Night of the Banshee. He wanted to shoot his short story Night of the Banshee, turn it into a
Mhm.
film, and wanted to cast her, which happened, and I think that film is lost. It seems to have happened according to Nightmare of Ecstasy, but anyway, what we know is that he does cast her in Revenge of the Dead / Night of the Ghouls, and a couple interesting things about that. She's not 16 years old; she's 27 years old by this point, and we know that. I've written some articles at Edward Wednesdays where you can look up some of the information related to that, as well as see some of her high school yearbook photos. And she looks great. She's very striking. She has a very striking look, obviously, always, but she's striking in her high school yearbook photos, and you could tell she had the makings of a star. But she was born um, around oh god, Downey, California, I think. But her parents were immigrants. Her dad Valdemar and her mom Francine. Her dad Valdemar was of Danish ancestry. Her mom Francine of French ancestry. And then I'm jumping way ahead, a quarter century ahead from her birth in 1932, to an article in 1958, late 1958, that says she's in a movie, Night of the Ghouls. I think it actually refers to it as Revenge of the Dead in that article. So she's in this film, and she's going to be a great star. This is the movie that's going to make her a star. The movie has just come out, and it has a picture, actually. We see Criswell in the picture as well as her, and it gives some other details. There's also this lengthy article that goes into her ancestry. She worked at the Bellflower. No, oh God, is it Bellflower? She grew up in Bellflower. She went to, I think, Excelsior Union High School in Norwalk. This was the area of 15 miles southeast of LA, the same area, Norwalk, Downey, Bellflower, where it was all space industrial sort of work, right? Most people would have been working for Lockheed Martin, stuff like that. But her dad is listed, I think, in the 1940 census as a quote unquote milker. So a farmer, right? An immigrant who was a farmer. But nonetheless, she was on like the committees in high school and things like that. She was clearly an up and comer. She was in all the theater shows in school and things. And then I think she became part of the Bellflower Community Playhouse. Subsequently, somehow got some invite to the Pasadena Playhouse. And that's why her parent, supposedly, according to this one article, that's why her parents decided to move to LA or Beverly or near Beverly Hills, because she had an opportunity now to get into acting and things of that nature. She also, I found evidence of this. She also became a model working for Rita Leroy, who was on TV around LA, local TV around LA, along with people like Corla Pandit and Criswell, another one of those local TV stars at the time. So modeling will of course come into our conversation, I think, here very shortly, but that's a little background that gets us up to the point where she's in Night of the Ghouls. And it was most fascinating, Bob. Night of the Ghouls, the only Ed Wood movie she's in, and there are all these people in the Ed Wood pantheon. We think about Tor Johnson, we think about Bela Lugosi, et cetera, Paul Marco, et cetera, et cetera. But Valda made this impression on everybody on the basis of this one role, and a fairly brief role, frankly.
Yes. And what's interesting about this, see, once again, the age factor. That's what she told me. She lied about her age to me too. I mean, it wasn't a vicious lie. It's not like
Right, right.
it was just, many actresses do this. She just wanted to appear younger, and she was in Hollywood. This kind of sexism still exists in Hollywood even today. Okay, where
Yeah.
they don't want to. You don't see many roles for women in their 50s or 40s or 50s, or certainly not in their 60s, as you do for women who are like younger, okay, in their in their 20s, okay. And I know she was concerned about that. There was a certain ageism there that we talked about that, and so she said there was a lot of when I talked to her, she said, oh, there's a lot of prejudice in Hollywood, you wouldn't believe it. And because she was always looking for work. She knew people in the big studios, she knew people in the independent market. But she told me she was, and this is, she always used to say, I was sweet 16 when I appeared in Night of the Ghouls. And that's what she said to me. I'll never forget that. That's exactly what she said. She goes, oh, Bob, I was sweet 16 when I appeared. And that's what she always said. I was sweet 16, but she wasn't. She was sweet, whatever, If she was,
Sweet
if she,
27,
yeah,
sweet
if she,
27.
yeah, if she was born, if indeed she was born, and I think that's pretty much established in 32. I think her birth certificate's out in
Mm,
public now. Then she was almost 30 years old. So, and that says something right there, because even you can be. You can be washed up when you're in your mid to late 30s or 40s, in Hollywood,
right.
and
She did look very young,
right.
obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
She
she
looked
looked younger than her age.
even in when you watch the Plan 9 Companion,
Mhm,
this is only a year or two before her death when she shot that footage. So
mhm.
she's in her late 50s. She doesn't look like she looks like somebody who's in her late 30s perhaps.
Right.
She
Yeah.
always looked very young. Yeah.
Yeah. She looked very young, and she was very concerned about that, her image. So I'm sure that's why she, maintained she was younger than that. But anyway, I mean, she would have been if she probably did meet Ed, I would imagine, right around just before that, when he was making that short film. The one that supposedly she was in the short film, and then
Right.
she was, maybe that was a lost film. Maybe I had heard that they started shooting, or they didn't. It really didn't get into full production. Okay, even that
Okay.
short film, I didn't have enough money. That's what I had heard. But maybe someday it'll appear. Who knows? But
Right.
that
You never know, right? Yeah.
she she told me the same story. And then there's a John Carradine. It says in the book that Ed came backstage with John Carradine. John Carradine, the man who appeared in over 400 movies, I think. The man who appeared in Grapes of Wrath, John Ford's Grapes of Wrath. A great actor. I mean, at least in that film, he was a. I mean, John Ford loved John Carradine. He was a stagecoach. He was in Grapes of Wrath. Those are great films, and he had major roles in those films. He was a great actor. He was a stage trained actor, and it's in the Rudy Gray book he talks about how she said that they came backstage, and Ed had brought John Carradine back with her, and John Carradine was impressed with her performance, which he sat through part of it, and Ed was there, and then she got cast in Night of the Ghouls. I guess another actress has been cast, but Ed wanted her, and finally they said, okay, just she's in the film. And to me, she makes. I just watched the film again recently, about 2 weeks ago, and she really makes the film. I mean, the other actors, I mean, are okay, and you get Kenny Duncan, who was kind of like she told me he was like a father figure to her, Kenny Duncan.
Yeah.
Ed Wood, she said, was like a brother figure to me. He was like a brother to me. But she said Kenny Duncan was like a father figure, and he was always giving her fatherly
Well,
advice. And he was a real kind of tough guy actor. He plays the gangster in. He played gangsters. He played gangsters on television, I believe, and in some
like
really cheap movies.
he
And
was he was generally considered the quote unquote meanest man in the West, the meanest man
yes,
in westerns
yes,
back
yeah,
in the going all the way back I think to even the late 30s, but
right,
certainly through the 40s and B westerns.
right,
And he was good friends with Ed, really close friends with Ed. That's a whole other story for another day. But
right.
I think yeah, Kenny of course is in Night of the Ghouls, and this is where timing comes into weird play. But I mentioned I mentioned the Corriganville Ranch a little bit, very briefly, but
Mhm.
that's of course Crash Corrigan's place. Crash Corrigan was
Right.
a star of serials, and he of course would have known Kenny Duncan. Crash also was the guy who wore the gorilla suit in a whole bunch of movies over the course of decades, like The White Gorilla,
Right.
Ed's Bride and the Beast, Ed's scripted Bride and the Beast rather, but also uh, Crash's ex-wife happened to be there when the whole scene went down when Carl Alfalfa Switzer was killed, right? By a
Mm.
guy who was used to work for Crash Corrigan at the Corriganville Ranch. And Corriganville Ranch, Bob, is so interesting to me because lots of westerns were shot there, lots of TV shows,
Right.
features, but also lots of people used to go shoot at Corriganville Ranch, and you can see it in old loops and old photo features for glamour and pinup models. They
Mhm.
shot at Corriganville Ranch commonly when they would shoot, you know, girls standing on the rocks,
Right. Right.
in
It
El
was
Flagrante, yeah.
it was like the Spawn Ranch.
Kind of, yeah.
You
Not
know,
not quite. Well,
but
kind of, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
it was like the Spahn Ranch,
Yeah.
which Quentin Tarantino made famous in his Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which
Hmm.
and that was a real place, and then the character Bruce Dern was a real guy, was a real person,
March
and
one. Yep.
the Manson gang hung out there, as they were planning
Yep.
their massacre. That's a true story. But yeah, that was a cheap movie set for lots of grade B westerns. That was a movie set for some Al Adamson's films in the 1960s, The Spahn
Oh
Ranch.
yeah. Yeah.
I
And
think.
and well, going even further back, Corriganville, there was also a big rock at Corriganville that they called Gorilla Rock,
Aha.
which it looked like the face of a gorilla looking up to the sky. So you would see it in the backgrounds. It was actually not. It was literally probably like 100 or
Uh-huh.
200 yards
Uh-huh.
behind the street, right?
Mhm.
The old Western street that had been recreated. But when you would shoot it, and you'd get off the street, it looked like it was out in the middle of nowhere, and it was very evocative. So I've seen lots of pinup models, standing there next to Gorilla Rock,
Mhm.
in their
Mhm.
birthday suits, and
Mhm.
so I don't know how did we get off onto this?
Well, no, it's
I
easy to
I
get
did
off
it, right? I'm the
when,
one who mentioned. Well,
when you're talking
so
about Ed Wood. There's so many tangents you can get off on. By the
sure,
way, Ray Crash Corrigan I believe, is in Ed Wood's Take It Out and Trade, which came
he's
out, a few years ago on a beautiful Blu-ray, and when you see it on Blu-ray, it's definitely Ed Wood's best directed film. Te-
it
it's te-
is.
it's technically and artistically his best directed film. I
It's
mean,
really well edited. It's
yeah.
funny. He
It's
does.
well
He
edited. It's
right.
imaginatively photographed, and it's beautifully done. And Ray Corrigan has a walk on in that film, and I think I pointed it out. I think I took a screenshot of it and posted on the Ed Wood page. But in any case, those are the players. And Kenny Duncan was a good friend of hers. He was like a father figure, and she told me all these Kenny Duncan stories that he was a heavy drinker too, and
Sure.
and he
Yeah.
he would he would come on, and he was playing like a con man in that Night of the Ghouls, and it was a fake ghost. She was the fake ghost. He was ripping people off. He was like one of these fake swamis, and she said he would come on the set. He would be drinking, and he would just have his lines remembered. He was a total pro, and she said they had a lot of fun making Night of the Ghouls. Okay, and that she would, and Ed had planned. Ed told her, he goes, "Honey, we're going to be making more films together after this." Unfortunately, that didn't hit. I think Ed only directed one more film after that, The Sinister Urge, for that era, and then didn't direct again until like the late '60s or early.
Yeah, from what we understand, and then it's take it out and trade, or I think actually the only house in town might precede
No,
that.
no, Take It Out and Trade was 1970, shot in late '69, I believe, and
Uh,
then the only
the
house.
clappers on take it out and trade are 3 days across late January, I think like January 15, 16, 17 or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, and I posted a picture of that clapper on the thing that let board a few weeks ago. Yeah, 1970, and then then they shot the only house or Necromania right after that at the Hell Guthu Studios, which meant in Hell Guthu's house. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
in any case, but Ed spent 10 years without directing, so he couldn't give Valda any parts. I guess he did he I think he wanted her for a part in the Sinister Urge, but couldn't do it for some reason. She couldn't do it.
There's also this story, Bob. The what the hell is it called? The giant salami or the
Right.
gigantic with Joe E. Brown. Ed wrote
Yes.
some script and Joe E. Brown wanted Valda to play
Yes.
the role in it,
Right.
and I guess it's nebulously like around 1960. Supposedly, Ed wrote the script. I've
Yes. He
never,
did.
obviously, that doesn't exist that I know of, but it probably does. All
Right.
this shit turns up
Oh
somehow.
no, I would bet he wrote it because he spent most of his time was spent writing. Okay, he was a
Hmm.
Ed Wood was a very prolific writer. He wrote if you
Sure.
talk about it on the page, he wrote how many novels did he write? I mean, they're these kind of pulp novels or
It's a
pulp.
good
They're
question.
they're
Yeah.
they're pulp fiction, but he wrote dozens of them. And I mean, I've written one novel which was published. It took me like 2 years to do it. You know what I mean? And it
I
was
think
like,
I think Ed wrote. We know of about 55 to 60 that we can
That's a lot. Right.
definitively ascribed to Ed, and there's
Right.
probably 10 more that are in some kind of like
Right.
nebulous zone. I think I feel Ed wrote 140 or so
Right.
novels.
Right.
I, that's
And
just me.
it's anyone who writes a novel will tell you it's not easy to write a novel.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
and I wrote a short novel which was published, and that was not easy because you not only got to have a beginning, middle, and end. You have to have stuff going on, and you have a lot of. It's not like writing an article and editing an article. It's a novel, and
Yeah.
you've got to make sure it's when you turn it in at least to the copy editor that that it's readable. Okay, and
Right.
to write that much, he was writing all the time. He was writing all the. So I'm sure that script was written, and she told me he was just busy writing all the time. And she knew him throughout the 60s when he was not directing, and she told me that he would just tell her all the time, yeah, I'm looking for directing work. I'm looking for directing work. I'm writing. And the biggest deal for him in the 1960s was getting hired by A.C. Stephen
Right.
to
Yeah.
write to film his script Orgy of the Dead. And Ed was on that set every day. He was like assistant director. He also, I don't know if he's credited as assistant director, but Valda told me he was pretty much the assistant director on that film, and he was on that set every day. And when they were filming his script, that was in 1965, and he was very happy to be there. She didn't like A.C. Stephen Apostolov. Is that the way you pronounce his name?
Yeah.
The Bulgarian
Right.
guy, and Stephen Apostolov. She didn't like him. She thought that he was using Ed, in that not and he had written Ed. She said Ed had spent most of the early '60s writing scripts for him to film, and he gave them to him. And A.C. Stephen Apostolov, he would pay Ed very minimal amount of money. Sometimes, I'm sure it was like,
Yeah.
if Ed needed $10, you know what I mean, he would give it to him and said, "No, don't worry about Ed. Don't pay me back. Just write me a script, okay?" It was that kind of relationship, He would, but I'm sure. I think Ed's biggest paycheck for the whole decade of the 1960s was probably when Orgy of the Dead. Who knows how much he was paid for that? Who knows? And then he sold that script for that other film, another film which was filmed in Japan, I think, or the Philippines. About the
Oh.
Right. It's got
Yeah.
the Revenge of Dr. X or the right,
Right, right.
right,
I can't remember the original title either.
right. It's got
That's a wonderful movie. That's a strange movie. Yeah.
right, but he was writing scripts which other directors filmed during the 1960s,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm sure he was grossly underpaid for those. Like in the 1970s, when I first started writing for a regional magazine and paper, I was paid. I started out maybe getting like 7,500. At the end of the 70s, really, I was getting paid like $150, $200 for an article, and that was pretty good. I'm sure Ed was getting paid very, very low for the scripts he was selling to producers like A.C. Stevens or whoever produced the
You know,
Japanese film. He was getting paid probably $100, a few $100 for those things, and that was his way of making a living. Plus, he was doing a lot of nonfiction writing. A book by Bob Blackburn's coming out about his nonfiction writing, so that should be
yeah.
educational. He was selling articles and promos and things like that, but he was writing all the time, even though he wasn't directing. But
Oh,
okay, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say he's insanely prolific, Bob.
Right,
I mean, in ways I think that we haven't even I'm trying really hard, me and some friends of mine, to try to dig deeper to try to find more that he may have written. But you're right. I think Orgy of the Dead is certainly an opportunity for him to get sort of back into the film industry.
right,
In the early 60s, he was working for a little while for a defense contracting company,
right.
Autonetics, and probably making a decent living then. I don't know how he blew it. I assume he too many missed days of work because he was drinking. I
Now
really
the
think that. I don't know that, but I feel that way.
Now the Autonetics job, that was in the early 60s. He was also working for
Right.
another company in the 1970s, writing and supposedly directing
Oh,
industrial stores.
for Pendulum.
But the Autonetics job, he was working there, and I understand that he did do some shooting and directing of some small things, but it wasn't like directing films. Okay, they weren't like feature films, obviously, but he did do some writing, and he did do some supposedly some kind of filmmaking for Autonetics. from what I understand.
Right. Yeah, that's extremely complicated. I think he had been getting a paycheck, weekly paycheck from a
Right.
defense contractor,
Right.
decent gig for a little while. But at some point he starts, like you said, he starts writing for adult publishers. There's a whole there's so many things to untangle. It's unbelievable. His relationship with Forey Ackerman when
Right.
Forey was his agent.
Yeah.
There's when we get into the 60s, real quick, on Stephen Apostoloff, a really great book. Joe Blevins, co-writer, as well as Jordan Todorov, wrote a great book about the films of Stephen Apostoloff, and
Mhm.
you guys should all go check that out. It's phenomenal. I actually have had a few chats with a couple of Stephen's kids, and they're really cool, and they've told me some cool stories about Ed. Uh, yeah, so I think Stephen Apostoloff actually, gave Ed regular work during a time frame,
Right.
and it was
Right.
hard to find a lot of regular work, even though he's writing for magazine publisher Pendulum, sometimes shooting for them,
Right.
maybe shooting loops for them,
Right.
obviously every now and then shooting a porn film like Necromania. It's
Right.
all extraordinarily complex what he was actually getting himself into. But
Right.
we're going way far afield, because let's go back to Valda,
Mhm.
because the relationship you had with Valda, she told you a lot of things, and she told you, I think, based on what you've told me previously, some things I think that the folks here at the Edward Summit podcast are going to really appreciate as something they've never heard before.
Right. Right. Well, she told me a lot of different things. She told me, about number one, about some of the other films she appeared in, like the Steckler film. But she told me she had worked for some magazines, some adult type magazines in the 50s. In the 50s, this was even, I think, this was like in well, she wouldn't have said it was in the 50s, but I think it was probably when she was in her mid 20s. Okay, so in her mid 20s, because she was saying she was 16, she was in her mid 20s, like in the mid 50s then, right? I mean, or
Right.
okay, so I think she was working for. She said she was working for these magazines in the 60s and 70s. I think she might have been working for some magazines even in the 50s, maybe the
Sure.
late 50s, just before she was in the Night of the Ghouls. So she definitely wasn't 16, but these weren't like porn or anything like that. These were like these are just like maybe just some adult magazines, maybe modeling some clothes or stockings or stuff like that. Okay,
Right.
and
Like
that
pin up or glamour
the
kind of
yeah,
stuff.
pinup. They were
Even
pinup.
fetish, right? Maybe it was
Right. Yeah.
fetish, right?
Yeah. And she said that basically, and then in the 1960s, the mid 1960s, when Ed was doing a lot of writing, and she said she used to talk to him all the time. Like he, he said, "Honey, I sorry, I can't." Ed was trying to find her work in movies and legit movies at that time, and trying to, because she was like she wanted to be an actress, and she was having a hard time. Ed was looking for work. He goes, "I can't find your work, but I got to tell you, I just got a job with Apostoloff, and he's gonna make my movie, the Orgy of the Dead." So that was going on at that time, and I think
Yes.
about that time she did some modeling for some various type of fetish magazines. Okay, and she would have been how old at that time? Like in 65, 66, 67, in her, like, what, early 30s.
I think that's quite frankly, Bob, a real bombshell in my mind. I never had heard that before, and
Yeah.
it makes sense. It makes sense given the area she lived, the milieu, the people she was associated with. It seemed like if you had to make a living, right? Because quite frankly, she has these very minuscule parts in not even a whole bunch, but a handful of movies spread
it's
across
it's
a
it's not that
vast
much.
period of time. You can't make a living off of that, not even
Well,
remotely.
I was asking her, I said, "Well, what were you doing then in the 60s?" Okay. And once again, she played this game, well, how old she was, but it makes more sense now since I found out, what her real age was. So in the mid to late 60s, in that decade there, when she was saying she was, like, in her, like, you know late teens, early 20s, she was actually an actress looking for work, who was in her 20s going into her 30s. Okay.
Yeah.
So Ed was trying to find her work, she said, and she was struggling, and she did a lot of posing for various types of magazines. Some were men's magazines. They had a lot of men's magazines out then, which aren't around anymore. Okay, and these weren't
I know it.
fully.
You don't have to tell me. I know it.
These weren't like porn magazines or fully nude. These were like, these were 60s style, 1960s style pinup magazines. She
Right.
said she also posed for some true crime type magazines
Wow.
where they would pose. Yeah, she goes, I would, she said she would be there like a gun ma with a holding a gun and having maybe a short skirt on or black lace stockings, and then there'd be like a gangster next to her, and then on the ground would be like a dead gangster,
Damn.
or she'd be coming out of a car and dressed kind of in a sexy way and falling down because because a mugger was beating her up.
That's
Those type of magazines were all over the place in the
that's
1960s.
a Bob, that's a fucking bombshell, really,
Right.
man. I mean, I had never heard that before. And now you're gonna have me and a whole bunch of other guys looking at a whole bunch of true crime magazines looking
Right.
for Valda Hansen.
Well,
And
that's what she told me. Okay, and I said, what were the names? And she told me the names of some of them. And she said one of them I think was called it was something crime. Okay, but it wasn't true crime. It was. She said one was called something crime. Another one was called thugs and something. Thugs and dames. Not that
yeah,
exactly. Titles like that, and they're kind of like these really these I remember seeing these magazines when I was a teenager, like in barber shops, okay, where the barber would have them, but this is like a 66, 64, 65. They weren't nudie magazines, but they were like one step above nudie magazines, okay.
right, right.
And then she said she did appear in some fetish magazines and she did do some nude, she said, in the late 60s, early 70s. And she said she really wasn't hot in that type of work. She said she wouldn't do any kind of she said she had a chance to appear in some hardcore stuff, but she refused to do anything like that. She didn't want to get in any involvement, anything like that. She disapproved of that. She wasn't for her. But she did appear in some of those type of magazines, and she said she really enjoyed it, and she said it was no big deal. And they were all over the place back in the city. You don't see these type of magazines anymore. Maybe you see the National Enquirer, but you don't see anything like that. These true crime, sleazy true crime magazines
Yeah.
anymore.
Well,
And then and then she said that she was really happy. She got the role in the Great Northfield, Minnesota mine raid, the Philip Kaufman film, which I just saw for the first time a few weeks ago on a, I picked it up on cable, and
Kaufman's a great filmmaker. He's real young when he made that. Might have been one of his very first movies, right?
right, and that was made in '72. Like
Yeah.
there's a scene in that where, David Carradine's in that, and she knew David Carradine, and she was going to tell me some stories about him, but she didn't get the chance to. And then she got really sick. So, but she said that she said yeah, she said Cliff Robertson was really nice. But there's a scene where Cliff Robertson waves up to one of his prostitute friends in the upstairs floor of a saloon, and you see a bunch of hookers there. Valda Hansen is one of them. Okay,
Yeah.
and have you seen the movie?
I have not. I know it from
Well,
her
well,
filmography, but I wanna see it,
well,
obviously. And now you make me wanna see it more. I thought Phil Kaufman, David Carradine, now I need to absolutely see it.
right, and they're in the town and they're planning the not this it's kind of a historical western. It's there's been a lot of movies about what happened, but that was a real mind read. That was probably the best movie made about that particular event in history because they show it from all different perspectives. They went in there and they were trying to get politicalists. They were promised politicalists. They were promised a pardon. Okay, and the politician promised a pardon couldn't deliver it, and so they decided to rob this really prominent, large bank, unrobbable bank. And Valda Hansen is in the scene where they're scoping out the town, and they wave to her, and she's in this window with in the top of a saloon, waving back with a bunch of other
That's
ladies.
cool.
Okay, you just see her among other, and she's very scantily clad. She looks really nice.
Always,
Yeah,
always. Yeah,
she looks like she's in her really early 20s. You know what I mean? And that
yeah.
I remember she looked
Can I
once.
can
Yeah,
I
go.
interrupt you? I've been sitting here drinking beer tonight, and I need to take a minute or so. I'm just because we're on Skype and I don't know how this recording's gonna work. I'm not even gonna stop it. So
Okay,
if you're cool with that, Bob, I'm gonna walk away. I'll
go
be
ahead.
right back, everybody. Thank
Sure.
you. Thank you. Thanks, Bob.
Okay.
you're very uh gentlemanly to deal with
Oh,
the what
no.
we do here at the Edward Summit podcast. So, so many things. I mean, so many things that we're talking about that are absolutely fascinating. But I wanted to talk real quick about so Valda. Also, this is way afield, but I found an ad featuring her, and it said model Valda Hansen represents Polytabs, which
Right.
was like some kind of health supplement. And you talked
Right.
a little bit about how she was into that.
Right. Right. Yeah. And at the, she said, she told me, Bob, I've been in health substances, or I've been into health supplements all my life. And she said, since I was a little girl. And this is very complex too. I mean, we're going to go on forever about this, but Valda Hansen, when she told me, she said, Bob, she goes, I spent most of my time trying to build a career as an actress, as a legitimate actress, as a legitimate model. Okay, she wanted to model for like clothing or for do commercials, regular
Yeah.
mainstream commercials on television. She wanted to be in Hollywood films, you know. And she said, I spent most of my time once I got to Southern California, once we got to Hollywood, and pounding the pavements, looking for jobs. Ed would try to find me work. She goes, but she said I spent at least 50% of my time on the beach. The beach. Now think about this for a second. Just hang with me. She goes, I was a beach girl. She goes, I was
Hmm.
part of the beach culture of the
Okay.
1960s. Of the 1950s, she goes, I was on the beach because I was a teenage girl on the beach. We know she wasn't really a teenager; she was in her 20s. So that means, but that means she must have been out on the beaches in the 1940s. Okay, if you follow me, do you know what I mean?
Yep.
If,
Yep.
if we go, if we go on the real timeline, not the Valda timeline, that she must have been on beaches hanging. And she goes, I used to hang out since I was 10 or 11 on the beach all day. Okay, I would go out there with my mom. Okay, all day,
Oh.
and all day, all day, all day, every day, 7 days a week. You know what I mean? We got to Southern California. It was all day and all night. Sometimes they go into the clubs on the beach. And she goes, I would spend 50% of my time when I got out to Hollywood. I was on the beach, all the LA beaches, all the time. And she told me that's where she thinks she picked up the cancer from, the
I was
sun.
just I actually had that thought as you were saying, and I thought that's a very dark thought. But
Yeah,
yeah,
but
it
she
was
no, but she told me that. She said, Bob, she goes, because when we were talking about it, she goes, yeah, I'm taking all these supplements now. And I said, well, did you have, is there cancer in your family, Valda? What is? And she said, Bob, she goes, I think I got it from being on the beaches. She goes, I spent, she goes, because I tell you, I spent the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right up to the time I got, diagnosed with cancer. I was on the beach all the time,
wow.
as an adult, as a child. And
Yeah.
and she goes, this just was a few hours. She goes, I was a beach girl that we used to just go there in the morning and bring baskets of food. We'd bring booze, you know what I mean? The adults would drink. We would eat. We would swim. We would eat. We would swim. We would just lay on the beach all day. And she said, I spent a lot of my time there. She said, she goes, and, you'd see famous movie actors out there in the Southern California beaches. You see producers out there. You see directors out there. And you would see all kinds of people out on the beaches. And she said, that's how I think I picked it up. And because she said, she said, this isn't well known. It wasn't well known then, but it's well known now. That, the sun is radiation, that's
Yeah.
when you're in the sun, it's supposedly good when you're in the sun all the time. Well, it's not that good because the sun is the greatest producer of radiation we have in our galaxy, okay, is the sun. And if you're out in it all the time, that's a problem, okay? As much as she was. And she said, I was out in it all the time. She goes, that must be how I picked this up. And that she said that, we would, when I got to Hollywood in the 50s, and that we would just be out all day. And then at night, we would go to nightclubs and we would meet people. And then in the 60s, she goes, basically when Ed was working, she goes, she goes, I used to ask Ed, Kathy to come out on the beach. She goes, sometimes Kathy would, but she goes, Ed said, I don't have time to come out on the beach, honey. He goes, I'm writing all. He goes, I got a script to write. I'd never had time. He goes, I'd never had time to go out on the beach. He goes, but I was still out there
Right.
every day. And that was like 10 years after she had gotten to Hollywood in the late 50s. Okay.
Right.
And so, she talked a lot about that.
Yeah.
And she said, she goes, now I have all these supplements. And she said, I used to work advertising or promoting supplements. So that must be what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Was
Yeah.
that in the magazine print ad?
It was a printout. I don't even. It was in a very
Right.
obscure. I can't even remember what it
Well, she
was, but you
she
can look
told me.
that up on the Edwood Wednesdays. You
Uh,
can look the article up, and you'll find the Polytabs ad. But
she told
apparently,
me.
I think Polytabs continued to persist for decades after that. And again, it's probably I'm being really cynical here, Bob. It's a horseshit supplement, right?
Right.
Polytabs, right?
Right. But she said that she believed in supplements, and she said she met a lot of people in that industry, in the supplement industry, and she said they used to send her supplements all the time, well, for years. You know what I mean? And
Wow.
she said when they found out she was sick, they sent her supplements, and she was taking all these supplements when I was talking to her. She said, "I'm going to beat this cancer." She said with these things that I'm taking, and she was on like this diet which had she was eating different types of like seaweed type diet. You know what I mean? You're eating all these things that are all different kinds of vegetables. She was telling me about some of the stuff she was eating, and some of it was she had picked up from like people she knew, Japanese people or Chinese people were sending her stuff, and she was eating and on those kind of diets, and she was really trying to beat her cancer disease holistically with eating with
Yeah.
natural ways, but she had no pain medication, and frequently we would talk for a few hours, and she just had to stop talking because she was in such
That's
pain.
sad. That's really sad.
And
Really sad.
that's a sad ending to all this.
For sure.
Going back, going back a bit, I do want to get this in here. She told me she told me about the making of Night of the Ghouls, and she said it was pretty. She was Ed told me. She said, I saw the script and said Ed told me he asked her, said, "Did you?" He said, "Valda, he goes, did you ever see any films? This guy in Sweden, Ingmar Bergman, and and Valda said, yeah, I think I've heard him, but I haven't really seen any of his films. And she said, well, he makes nudie films or stuff with women topless. But she goes, but Ed said he's a really good filmmaker. He goes, and he gave me the idea. I saw one of his films, and she goes, in the film Ed was talking about, he said the film had like the character of death in it. Okay. And I was thinking of the famous Bergman film, The Seventh Seal.
Seventh Seal. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ed was talking to her about. She said Ed was talking to me about this film that had the character of death in it, and she talks about this. I got the page on page 154 of Nightmare of Ecstasy. She talks about Ed's preoccupation with death, and she said, and he said this film is really about death, and you're going to be playing a person who's pretending to be a ghost, and
Wow.
Kenny, of course, is a con man, but you are really a figure of death.
You
And
blew my mind, man.
yeah,
Bob,
but
you blew my mind. Thinking
no,
about Ingmar Bergman and Night of
yes.
the Ghouls as
And
possibly having some kind of correspondence. That's
well, oh yeah,
right.
she said Ed was talking to me about this guy named Ingmar Berg. She said she had seen some of his films by the time we were talking, but she goes, he was the one who told me about Ingmar Bergman. She goes, and I've seen some of his films, and she goes, and I think they're very similar to Ed's films. She goes, and I really didn't see his films until years after Ed had died, and she saw him on videotape. You know what I mean? She goes, I finally saw one.
Yeah.
And she goes, oh yeah. She goes, that's the film. She goes, that's the guy Ed told me about. And she goes, yeah, those films. She saw some of his old black and white films, and she said, yeah, that Ed was really said he had seen them. Ed had seen the films at Hollywood screenings or something. You know, they played in America. And she said, Ed, she goes, I want to tell you, Valda, this is what I want to do. We're going to make a film about death. This is, and she said, you are kind of the representative of death. And she said, and that's how they got into this whole.
Wow.
This story's been told. That's how she said, Ed, he goes, I'm just going to concentrate on one thing. I'm going to concentrate on your hands. And he said, gee, he spent most of my time on, the famous hand movements she does. Those, yeah, with the fingers. She said that she said, Ed told me, he said, Valda,
I can't do it.
He said, Valda, don't act. He told her not to act. He goes, you don't have to act in this. All you have to do is stand there, wear the wardrobe, wear the wet wardrobe, and all you got to do is move your fingers like Bella moved them. Okay.
Right. Right.
And that's what it says in the book here. Other people have told the story, but she told me that in 1990 when I talked to her. She goes, Ed told me. He goes, Valda, don't act. Just move your hands like Bella moved them in this 1940s film. When like Bella moved them in Dracula, because that was one of Ed's favorite films. Moving like Bella moved them in some serial. Ed was talking about some serial that Bella was in, that he was moving his fingers in a weird way. And so you see Ed takes all these shots of just her hands and her fingers moving with the silver, fingernails. It's really weird the way she's moving her hands. But Ed just spent all his time photographing her hands and telling her about how he wanted her to be like this Ingmar Bergman film, and at the same time, like an old Bela Lugosi serial or Dracula, where he was moving, like when Bela like puts his hands out to try to hypnotize Van Helsing, he says, "Stop." He said Ed was talking to her about that scene when Bela as Dracula was trying to control people with his hand motions. He said, "That's what you're going to do in this film." And that's what she did. He goes, "I'm just going to concentrate on your hands. Don't try to act." He goes, "Don't move your eyes. Just walk and move your hands like that." And that's what she does. So that's a little behind the scenes thing, which she told me.
That's beautiful. Do you know, Bob? So she appeared in some TV shows back in L.A. I presume L.A. TV shows, local TV shows in the. I presume again it had to be mid 50s, give or
Right,
take, late 50s,
right.
including things like quote unquote championship bowling, like which had to have been a lot of fun. I would think I would like to see the episode of Championship Bowling with Valda Hansen. But do you have a sense, Bob, from your conversations with her, they seem to have had a relationship that persisted for a lengthy period of time, and it was relatively a close relationship.
With Ed Wood?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. She said I met Ed Wood. She had been in Hollywood. She goes, we moved up to Hollywood. She goes, the first person that she had made friends with, she told me, was John Carradine, because John
Yeah.
Carradine used to walk up and down the streets of Hollywood, Hollywood Boulevard, with a cape, with his cape and the top hat, and he would be
Sure.
reciting Shakespeare out loud, because
Beautiful.
John Carradine was a serious actor reciting Shakespeare, but he was also an alcoholic. Okay, he was loaded a lot of the time, day and night, and he was a heavy drinker. I mean, and he used to drink a lot with John Ford. John Ford was a very heavy drinker. Some people say he was an alcoholic, but
Yeah.
John Carradine and John Ford were very good friends, and John Ford was a real tough, hard-nosed guy, great director. He didn't really respect the actors, but John Carradine was an actor John Ford respected, because he knew he was a serious stage actor, and he knew John Carradine was well read and knew Shakespeare by heart. So he didn't get hard ass or John Ford, like even with John Wayne, he used to like make fun of him to get effects out of him, or say, "Come on, Duke, read your lines. Don't make any." He didn't act that way with
Right.
John. With,
Or
with
make
John,
make fun of Ward Bond's
right,
ass, how
right,
big Bond's
right.
ass was,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
he used to make fun of Ward Bond and John Wayne, and he used to make fun of all these actors and give them a hard time. He didn't do that with John Carradine, because John Ford respected people who were highly educated and very professional actors, and John Carradine was that. But she said that was the first person I met was John Carradine. He was really nice to me. He said, you're made for the world," or something like that, "and we're going to be good friends." And then Ed Wood supposedly surprised her by bringing Carradine back to Accidentally Yours after the show. But she said they stayed friends. She stayed good friends with John Carradine and Ed Wood for decades, and until Ed's death. And she was also good friends with Ed Wood's mother, Lillian. And
Wow. Wow.
after Ed died, she helped comfort Lillian, because Lillian was told that your son's dead. You know what I mean? She outlived her son, and she didn't. She helped comfort his mother. Because when the son dies before the mother, that's a sad state of affairs.
Sure. I've
So she,
never. That's again, Bob. That's a real astonishing
well,
information.
I think they talk about it. I think Rudy Gray.
Maybe.
I
I
think
can't remember.
I
Right.
think I think she talks about it in the Rudy Gray book too. Lillian Wood said, I'm just reading from the book, "I wish I knew just what he died of besides with a heart attack. I have no idea of something else, but I have an idea of something else, but I don't dare say it out. I don't want to say, but I don't know. It's one of those things that has me upset, not knowing what happened." That's Lillian Wood talking after Ed Wood's death, okay?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
Lillian Wood thought her son died of something else, but didn't dare say what she thought, okay?
And I think Lillian actually saw Ed on only literally count him on one hand,
Right,
handful of occasions
right,
from the time when he left Poughkeepsie, he
right,
came home after the war for a brief period.
right,
Once he left around circa
right,
1947 or so,
right,
she may have seen him on two or three occasions
right,
over the
right,
course of the last three
right.
decades of his life, right?
I don't think she had any idea of Ed's alcoholism. Okay,
Right.
I mean, and or Ed's, drinking, which was definitely on the alcoholic level, and she didn't have any idea about that or his lifestyle or how hard of a life he had lived, even though he had become a Hollywood, even though he become a filmmaker, which
Yeah.
his films are shown all over the world and nationwide at least, and in other countries. He wasn't. He lived. Ed lived in poverty till the day he died. Basically,
You make
he
such
lived.
a good. Go ahead.
Ed lived in poverty. I think this needs to be said. He lived in poverty till the day he died. He died. He got evicted from his apartment in the last week of his life. I mean, they took his body out of the apartment, out of Coe's apartment, in a garbage bag.
Yeah.
He was one step above homelessness. And so he lived in poverty for most of his life, but he did what he wanted to do. He wanted to make movies, and that's what Valda said to me. He said, "I respected Ed." She goes, "He wanted to make movies, and we watched out for each other." And she said that he tried to find me work when he couldn't. He tried to find Valda work, and he couldn't when he couldn't find work for himself. But they both continued to work, and then Ed passed away, and she is still looking for work. And
Right.
by the way, it says many references. Valda Hansen retired in the mid '70s. She told me, she goes, "No, I did not." She goes. Some people think that I've been retired. She goes, "I'm not retired." She said, "I just appeared in a film called Gun Crazy with Drew Barrymore. I had a role in that film, a small role." And I said, "Well, what's that about?" She goes, "Yeah." She goes, "I had a hot scene with Drew Barrymore." She goes, "It was a lot of fun." And and then she was going to tell me about it. She goes, and she had another trip to the hospital, but I never got a chance to talk to her again.
Okay.
And the last thing
Well.
the last time I heard from her was this letter where she sent me a filmography which had like the Ray Dennis Steckler film on it, Gun Crazy, and other films that I don't have the letter, but there's a few other films, at least a half a dozen other films that in the '80s that weren't on any filmography I've seen. Okay.
Here's a wild thought, Bob. Again, earlier today, I was doing a little background research, and Drew Barrymore is obviously in ET. And
Right.
at one point in an article with Valda Hansen, she talks about, I think it might be in Nightmare of Ecstasy. It might be in an interview article that's in Cult Movies. I think actually it's in the Plan 9 Companion, the
Mm-hmm.
documentary, The Plan 9. She said, Ed was like ET. He had this very he had this very you know, benevolent nature. He was like
Yeah.
somebody, and there's an element of transcendence I think they shared. She would say he would call me at night and tell me,
Right.
dark secrets of the
Yes.
soul kind of
Yes.
things, right?
Yes. 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 Exactly. Exactly. He would call her, and in fact, she even talks about here that Ed would call. She talks about it in the Gray Book that Ed would call her at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. Say, "I can't sleep. Let's talk." And he he would talk. He would say, "How you doing, honey? Are you looking for work?" And she said, "No."
Yeah.
Or, "Can you help me find?" They would talk about their job searches, and she said they would. And then she told that long story about how Ed called her when I was saying, "I want to talk to you about death," and and she said it kind of scared her, and that he went into this long. I think he was probably had been drinking this long spiel about death. Yeah, here it is. This is in the Rudolph Gray book. He was actually preoccupied with death. He used to phone me at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. He would say, "I want to talk about death." And he would tell me way out things like when a person dies and how their heart stops, but the organs are still living. And then he would say, just because you think you're dead, you're not dead. Oh my God, he'd just go on and on. So that's the kind of thing he would talk
Yeah.
about with her. Now, you got to remember, what was Ed Wood's favorite movie? Ed Wood's
Oh.
favorite movie,
Hmm.
The
I
Mummy.
don't.
The Mummy.
Okay. Okay.
And what's The Mummy about?
Yeah. The living.
The Mummy is about the
Somebody
living
who's
dead.
dead. The living
Yeah,
dead. Right.
it's about a man who was Boris Karloff. His character was buried alive or entombed alive after being wrapped up as a mummy for centuries. And then and
Yeah.
then and then an expedition in the early 20th century, they exhumed the mummy, and a spell was read by one of the student archaeologists when he was left alone with the mummy, and he came back to life, and he killed people. He got back at people who he needed to get back at, and he tried to find his lost love. And that was Ed's favorite movie. And that says a lot about Ed Wood. That movie is was Ed Wood's favorite movie, and that's what he was talking about when he called Velda at 1 in the morning, which is right
Sure.
at the end, which is right at the end of Nightmare of Ecstasy. And I think if you want to know Ed and Velda and their relationship, you would once again it talks about that in the Nightmare of Ecstasy, and that's you know that that was on her mind when she met with Rudolph Gray. I don't know how. I think she probably talked to him just a few years before her death. Because this book was
Yeah.
published in 1992, and she died in 1993.
Yeah. So, the mummy, the the dead. Think about headstones, right?
Right.
The actual credits of Plan 9. So
Yes.
yeah, his total death
Yes.
obsession.
Yes.
Let's go, Bob, because you told me something else. Valda shared with you viewpoint on Ed's sexuality, and this is something that
Mhm.
is not going to make a whole bunch of people sort of happy, because there's a genuine, simple viewpoint. He dresses as a woman, but he's really a guy, and it's
Yeah.
very cut and dried, and it's
Mhm.
not very complicated psychologically or
Mhm.
sexually. But
Mhm.
there's more to it than that. If
Well, I
you
think
want to talk about that, I'm sorry.
right, right.
I don't want
Well, no, no. She had just said that. We were talking about too that picture of Ed where he is dressed kind of in a very masculine way. You know that picture you're talking about in the
Yep,
documentary. I don't
yep.
know how he's. I haven't seen that document. I saw it a long time ago actually, but when did that come out? That's been out for how long? That documentary. That documentary you're talking about.
29 years, something like that.
Okay, I saw it a long time ago, but
Yeah.
I don't know what he looks like one of those 1950s kind of hipsters. In other words, we're very masculine, very,
Right.
very, very masculine,
I
right?
was looking on his feet. I was like seeing. I was like, is he wearing chinos? Right.
Right, exactly. And because I asked her, I said, "Well, what do you think about Ed? Where being a transvestite, wearing women's clothes?" And she said, "Oh, she said that's what he did." She goes, "He loved it." She goes, "He laughed about it." She goes, "He enjoyed it, and it was just part of his personality." She said it was he loved. He was a very theatrical person. He was an actor. I mean, just look at his performance and take it out and trade. He gives one. He gets one of the best performances in the film as Alicia, and he's wonderful.
Sure.
He was a natural born actor, and he loved acting. He loved wearing women's clothes. He loved being theatrical, and he thought it was wonderful. He wasn't ashamed of it. I mean, he's an ex-marine. You know what I mean? He he was in the invasion of Guadalcanal. Okay, which I don't know if you know about the invasion of Guadalcanal, but I mean, thousands of Marines were killed in that invasion.
Yeah.
Okay, uh, it was a pretty tough road. He survived it. I mean, he went through Marine basic training, and that's not basic training that everybody can go through. I mean, see the movie Full Metal Jacket. If you think the Marine training is easy, it's not. Ed made it through the Marine Corps training. That's the toughest training in the world. Okay.
He cleaned up bodies. He cleaned up bodies on little Pacific atolls.
Yes.
Yeah, he
Yes.
did. So he
Yeah.
smelled. He had the smell of death in his nose for
Yeah.
sure.
He
Right.
did. And he was a tough, hardworking guy. And she said, and I said, well, what do you think about Ed? She goes, we know Ed's married. I said, did he ever talk to? Do you think is he gay? Does he bisexual? She said, Ed. She goes, Ed. She goes, Ed Wood was a man's man, basically. That's what she said. She goes, he was a man's man. She said, I don't know if you'd call him gay. She goes, he was a man's man who liked to dress as a woman. She said he was a ladies' man. He loved women. He loved to look at women. He loved to have women in his films. He would flirt with women. She goes, they would go out to a restaurant, and he would be out, and even if he was with Kathy, he said he would like look at women, he would flirt with them, and I guess Kathy would get jealous. But he was a ladies' man. They didn't. Ed wasn't really didn't go out a lot, and I don't think he had enough money to. But she said he was out. He was kind of a night person, and he was like enjoyed going out. He enjoyed having fun, and there was a real macho man's man side of him, ex-marine, and then there was a side who liked to wear women's clothes.
Right.
And
You don't think though, Bob? There was an element, and I'm just asking because I wonder, an element of some kind of active bisexuality. or anything?
Maybe. I mean, there's maybe the bisexual side of him came out by acting women's roles, like in his own film, where he's Alicia and Take It Out and Trade.
Right.
You know, he seems like a real feminine character. He's dressed. I mean, he looks better than some of the actual women in the film. You know what I mean? He
And
looks.
I don't care. By the way, I'm not trying to make a statement one way or the other. I'm just
Right.
trying to.
I don't know. All I know is that she knew Ed Wood very well. She talked to him for days. He would talk to him at night. They talked about everything. And she said that he loved women. He was a ladies' man. He was a man's man. He was a hardworking guy. He was, and at the same time, he probably maybe was attracted to men. I don't know if it was ever consummated. I think that, and I think Ed presented gay people and you know trans people and transvestite people in a very, very positive light. Ed was way ahead
Yeah,
of his Ed was way ahead of his time.
I'm so I'm so happy. You have no idea, Bob. I'm so happy you said that because so many people try to take this sort of a
Right.
Ed portrayed, the limp wrist,
No,
all these
no,
sort of gay
no,
stereotypes, and I don't. He did on occasion, situationally, when he was writing like an Apostoloff screenplay, but
right,
no, not whatsoever. When he was writing short stories
right,
for Pendulum Gay magazines, not
right,
whatsoever. It was some of the most joyous stuff he ever wrote, and it
right.
was really clear to me that he was totally cool with total breakdown of our gender
Exactly.
norms or whatever the fuck you want to call them, because
Right.
he was beyond that.
Well, and that's what she told me. She said that she one of our last conversation with us. She said Ed was really ahead of his time. She goes, he loved women, he loved men, he loved gay people, he loved transvestites, he loved, look at Take It Out and Trade. I mean, there's
Right.
that one scene in the kitchen between the two, between the
Oh God, Jimmy Michael. I'm gonna write an article. The person with the red
right,
hair, the frizzy red hair, Jimmy Michael. I
right,
have a long article I've been working
right,
on it, and now you remind me I need to totally
right.
put that out there. So you remember 3 or 4 months ago or a year ago, I can't remember in COVID days how time has totally gone haywire. But The Lady in the Dale, the HBO Max series, The Lady in the Dale,
Uh huh.
there's a brief snippet in that movie where there is a person walking down Hollywood Boulevard, and it's Jimmy Michael from Take It Out and Trade, the red-haired, frizzy-haired person. She Jennifer Michael. Another long article I've got to write. So Ed was involved with people who were thinking in very progressive terms, and he
Yes.
wasn't. He wasn't like that. He wasn't this tight ass fucking Eisenhower 50s
No.
guy. Not
No.
at
No.
all.
No. He liked and was drawn to people, um, of the that community. Okay, he liked and featured gay people, bi people, lesbian people, trans people. He loved people he loved people who featured and who weren't afraid of their sexuality, who
Right.
wanted to be taken on their own terms, not given special treatment, but treated like full human beings and respected for what they are, not for the way they dressed.
Right.
Okay, and so he was very forward thinking. He loved those people, and he wanted them. He put them in his films. They're all. I mean, watch his films. Watch Take It Out and Trade. Watch some of his later films. Are very interesting. His last Necromania, I think, is got some very interesting stuff in it too. I hope they do that as an ag for release. And Ed
Right.
was
Right.
Ed Velda was right. Ed was way ahead of his time. He was. His novels are still with us. His films are still with us. He's still with us in a sense. More people know who he was. More people know who he was now than back in the early '60s when I was sitting up wanting to see that film late at night.
Right.
What I mean, nobody knew who Ed Wood was then. Now, lots of people know who he was.
You have no idea, Bob. You might actually. Ed Wood is with me on a daily basis for
Right,
sure. Right.
Right. I mean, and, I mean, once again, I mean, if more if another Ed Wood film comes out on Blu-ray, I'll go right out and buy it and bring it home and
Yep.
joyously watch it.
Yep.
I wish Valda Hansen was in more of his films. And she said that another thing she told me was Ed told me about more films he had planned with her, in the late 50s throughout the 1960s, but they never got made. He had lots of problems getting films off the ground throughout the 60s, and he didn't really get one off the ground until Take It Out and Trade. It took him 10 years.
Right.
And then he was working again for a few years, made 3 or 4 films in a row. And then he was back to acting and writing scripts for Apostolov, like Fugitive Girls, where he plays like a sheriff in that. Okay, he plays like a if I remember, he plays like a redneck type sheriff in that film, right?
He does. Yeah.
Yeah, but then
He also plays Pops, right? The
play,
guy who gets beat up by the women.
Right.
He also narrates the trailer. Like Ed's all over Fugitive Girls. Yeah.
And I love that film. Renee Bond's in that, and right, Renee Bond's in that, and and I absolutely adore Renee Bond. She's one of my favorite adult movie performers, and she's in that film. And Ed, so look at the role. He's playing like a redneck sheriff, and at the same time, a guy who gets beat up by a bunch of girls. Okay, I mean, that's a duality right there, isn't it? That's the duality of Ed Wood. That he could play 2 opposite type roles in the same film, which he wrote. Okay, and he's performing in and express his own duality, and he didn't even direct it.
And this is 19. I think I won't get into the details, but I think shooting of Fugitive Girls is summer and fall of 1973. So we are about 5 years or so from Ed's passing.
Right.
This is one of his last kind of moments in the sun, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he's able to be that involved, right? He narrates the trailer, right? And he does a great job. He pronounces things sometimes in his own sort of Poughkeepsie-ese, right?
Right.
The old Poughkeepsie-ese, but it's great, right?
Well, one of the things that Valda told me too was that around that time in the mid 70s, she said that she kind of they didn't stay in touch as much because things were getting pretty rough for Ed, okay, and his drinking was getting bad. And I don't know if you know anything about alcoholism is a progressive disease, okay?
Sure.
You don't get even if you stop drinking. Once you're an alcoholic, even if you stop drinking, you're still an alcoholic. Okay,
yeah.
It's like a diabetic. It's like once you're a diabetic, maybe you can not take insulin anymore, take the shots, but there's certain things you can't do. You know what I mean? You can't go out and eat a chocolate cake. You know what I mean? And but Ed never stopped drinking. He drank heavily right till the end of his life. And so that was going on. The drinking was increasing, his pressure was increasing. He probably couldn't even direct a film by that time. So maybe it was good that Apostolov was at least able to direct the film, but Ed could act. He could still write. He wrote. I'm sure there's a lot of writing that Ed did that hasn't even been discovered yet. Who knows where it
is. You bring up a topic near and dear to my heart. It's nearly a daily thing around here in my house, trying to find more Ed Wood
text. I'm sure there is.
And more Ed Wood text that no one's ever ascribed to Ed, right?
So, and Valda went through some very hard times in the 70s, and she told me she appeared in some other magazines that she said she didn't even want to talk about. I don't think they're hardcore, but she said she did some other she appeared in some other type of magazines that she didn't feel particularly good about, but she really needed the money, and she was trying to get, more roles in films, and she said she would go to. She told me she would go to casting agents and they said, "Oh, yeah, I did hear of you, but I heard that you retired." And she said, "No, I didn't retire." No. And she said that somebody was spreading rumors about her then that she had retired. And once in Hollywood, it's a very closed community. Once word gets around that you're this or that, people believe it. Okay, and she said she had a very hard time convincing people that she still wanted to work. She said that, so people would think, "Oh, maybe she's unreliable because she's retired and then came out of retirement." But she told me, she goes, "I just want to make this," because I was going to write an article about her and try to sell it and about Ed, do the whole thing. She goes, "Your article just keeps saying, Bob, that I was never retired from acting, and that I always wanted to continue to act, and it was circumstances that didn't allow me to do it. She goes, it wasn't me. So that's one of the last things she said to me. Also, that
So that you were gonna do that article like 25, 27 years ago, right?
well, I did do the so I started the article after I heard that she did this. I started the article. Then I didn't start it. I started to put it together. And then I said I better talk to Ray Dennis Steckler. Then I did. I talked with him, and he said, yeah, she was in this film. Cynthia the Devil's Down. She goes, she was wonderful. I have wonderful memories of her. She was in my favorite scene in the film, the best scene in the film. And I said, I still haven't seen that. And he said, I'll send it to you. He never did. He sent me some tapes. So he didn't send me that for some reason. But he did. Very nice guy. Ray Dennis Steckler was a really sweet guy, and very, very interesting conversation. So I did a really long series of phone calls and letters, and I was going to do a separate article on him, and plus have him in this big article. And then I lost contact with him, but he told me she was in the best scene in the film. When I finally did see it years and years later, and I got it on DVD now, you can't see her in the film. I can't find her. But he said it was in the Devil's Mask, the Black Mass sequence. Well,
Right.
that's a long sequence. It's got lots of people in it. It's a big, huge black mass. The writer of the film plays the devil, and there's a.
Is it Ron Haydock or no?
No. It's another guy. It's another guy. It's not Ron Haydock. I can't.
You know what I mean.
Yeah. I know who Ron Haydock. No, Ron
Right.
Haydock. I don't know if he's in the background there. No, but Boris Bachelov is in the film. He plays the father figure and the artist figure.
Okay.
And I forgot who plays Cynthia. Shula Ryan was her name. In any case, you can't find Valda in the film. And there's a lot of people, and it's a very complicated, long sequence of this black mass that's supposed to be taking place in hell, all these hallucination effects. But I can't find. Maybe I'll have to watch it again. But there's scenes which are distorted, and you see lots of people in the background. And I don't know if you've seen the film, but I can't find her in it. I assume she shot in the film. If he says she was there, I believe it then. Okay, I mean he's the director. He wouldn't have told me that if he didn't.
Right.
She wasn't there. I assume she was cut out of the film. I assume she was cut out of Gun Crazy if she was in that. I mean, Hollywood shoots a lot of scenes, and that's a Hollywood film, and so I imagine it went on the floor, And she said, "Yeah, I shot it." And she even told me, she goes, "Yeah, I shot a short scene with Drew Barrymore." She goes, "It was a very, very short scene," but she goes, "I was paid really well," and she said, She said she had to use all the money to pay medical bills that she got from her salary for that, and that was the last film she appeared in. And that film came out in 1992, I believe.
Right.
Which I've never seen the film. I've heard that people have seen it, can't find her, but I doubt if they kept her in it. But she never lived to. Because I said, "Have you seen the film?" Because I think it was out while I was talking. I said, "I think it just came out." She goes, "No, I haven't yet." But I just had the feeling that she was cut out of it. And of course, I'm sure if she was cut out of it, I'm sure they wouldn't tell her. Because when I talked to her, she said she didn't even have a formal agent. She goes, "But I have people who act as agents for me who help me out, So, but she didn't have the formal, typical Hollywood 10% agent,
Right. We'll find it. We'll find it, Bob. No doubt. We've been at this for a long time now, everybody, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. We're talking now. We're getting into like the weeds. Ron Haydock and Jim Harmon. We're getting into Forey Ackerman to some degree. We haven't said that, but you know what I mean. I know for sure. And what I want to say to everybody is I hope you guys, this is incredible stuff. Absolutely incredible stuff that Robert has been sharing with us. Bob's been sharing. Like the fetish, her being a fetish model, Ed being kind of conflicted about his sexuality. It's incredible. And we think that, but at least vis-a-vis Ed, but we don't know that. But I hope, is there, actually, I give you the closer, Bob. Do you want to say anything else before we
Well, the thing is, you got
close
to
this
remember,
out?
this is from her. This is what she told me. Okay, so I'm telling you what she told me by
Yeah.
with her voice, by letters. This is what she told me. I mean, the only thing I'm sure that she didn't tell me the truth about was her age. Okay, that I know.
Yeah.
Even then, had a feeling that that wasn't true. But she was she was pretty candid. She was very soulful, very nice, very gentle person. She wasn't the type of person who would BS you. So I'm pretty sure everything she told me was on the mark. She was really adamant about Ed Wood, that that she thought he didn't get his due, that certain people really kind of used him, didn't rip him off, and she was very sad about that. And at the same time, she just wanted to make clear that she was a serious actress who didn't really get the work that she wanted to get, but that she was very proud of what she did. Okay, and that
Well,
and she, according to her, that she never retired. She said, "No, I never did retire, and I never do plan to retire." And you got to remember, this was like what 30 years ago.
yeah, she
But,
was a hugely striking presence, obviously,
right.
immediately indelible, and it's
Unfortunately,
crazy to think about her involved in fetish work that we have not yet
right.
identified,
She said she
right?
was definitely involved in fetish magazines, and I don't, she didn't really name. She goes, she told me what type of fetish magazines they were, and she said that. And once again, these weren't like really hardcore magazines or anything like that. They just appeal. There were certain. They appealed to a certain type of readership, a certain type of reader of adult magazines, kind
Yeah,
of, kind of like the true. She was into the true crime ones in the 60s, maybe early
yeah,
70s. But at that time, those magazines were phasing out, those true crime ones. And
right.
then the fetish magazines were coming in. And I think in the 70s and even into 80s, she was doing some work there. She said she said that they would always pay her the same day. Okay, they would always she would go in and she would do a shoot. Sometimes she would have to bring in props, and they would pay her like right there, sometimes in cash, sometimes
Yeah,
or they'd write her a check. Okay, and
right.
but so they were mostly like day jobs, or she said 90% or 99% of them were like day jobs. She didn't have any really long term employment.
Yeah.
It's funny, but she worked for a lot of different magazines, but she was finding it very hard to find long term stable employment. I never got a
She
chance. I never got the chance to finish the article. Let me say this in closing, but this conversation is way. But we should dedicate this. I'd like to dedicate this to her memory. Very sweet, very nice person. To thank her for sharing all this with me, so I can share it with you. This should be dedicated to her and my way of finishing the article, in a sense. And I still like to finish my Ray Dennis Steckler article and talk about him someday. He was quite a
Yeah.
fascinating guy. He did all kinds of stuff. And so thanks again for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome, obviously, Bob. So yeah, go down that road with Ron Haydock and Jim Harmon or Steckler. But more importantly, it's been absolutely amazing that you've joined me here today. So I hope everyone here and Edwood Summit podcast once again, we're finding out things that you never heard about. I hope you found this beneficial, enjoyable, and I can't say enough, Bob, uh, for you joining me. But we'll be back, and I hope, Bob, you'll join me again someday. We'll talk about
Hope so.
something else, right? Something else. But
Thank you.
thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night.